Hail to the king, baby.
Welcome to this episode of Kingology with your host Mark. Today we are covering the novel Insomnia. Now, just a little word about the fact I'm soloing this. Herman was going to be coming on, and I was dearly looking forward to him coming on, and I know he was dearly looking forward to coming on, but life has gotten away from us. He unfortunately won't be able to be around for this recording, but I hope he'll be returning soon, and I look forward to that. And my best wishes go to all him and his family at this time. Just wanted a brief word about that. And, you know, I know you guys are going to miss Herman as much as I missed Herman. So I will struggle on, and unfortunately you'll have to put up with me alone for this one. So, Insomnia was first published in 1994, September 1994. I think it's King's 30th novel. I could be wrong, or 30th book at least. And we are returning to the town of Derry, Maine. I think we last encountered this in it, or was there a short story where it was also in it? I can't remember. But I mean, the most famous book and character we've covered in this Kingology series of episodes so far is obviously Pennywise from It, set in Derry too. And in fact, there are links back to Pennywise throughout this and a few other books indeed. Now, the main story involves, it's quite surprising. The main protagonist is a 70-year-old man who has just been widowed, called Ralph Roberts. Interesting choice of character for something like this. And essentially, we get a very slow rundown of his health suffering as sleep deprivation is causing him problems more and more as time passes on. And we get a fairly drawn out, though always interesting, sort of portrait of a man who's getting less and less sleep and really feeling it. And his issue is he keeps waking up earlier and earlier. And, you know, we get accounts of him trying every trick in the book to try and get more sleep. Going to bed late, trying all sorts of things, you know, honey and things to help sleep. But it does not prevent him waking earlier and earlier. And it starts to really wear on him. However, he refuses to go to his family doctor because his wife died through not a misdiagnosis, but possibly a misdiagnosis of that doctor, of his wife. So he still bears something of a grudge and does not trust that doctor, and can't bring himself to go see any other doctors. So he tries to use all sorts of folk remedies or suggestions, whatever, to try and get more sleep. But all this time he is suffering, and people notice he is suffering. In addition to this, he encounters a man who, for him, was always a good-natured and kind man, and in fact, the husband of and his wife, these two people were reasonably good friends of him and Ralph and his wife, when his wife was still alive, called Ed Deepno, who's married to a woman called Helen, and they also have a young daughter. I think her name's Natalie. Sorry, it's been a little while since I finished reading this, so I think her name's Natalie, the baby. But during one of the things Ed does is go for long walks while his wife is actually ill. You know, to get some fresh air, he goes for long walks and just wanders where he goes. But he does encounter Ed driving a car in a crazy way and pulling over a driver and acting really weird and using very foul language, where he keeps going on about the man's actually carrying dead babies in his truck, in these barrels in his truck, and the man sort of saying, "No, I'm not." And eventually, sort of, Ralph calms it down. The man who has been frightened by this interaction also, and I think also has been drinking a little, so he's frightened of the police being involved, allows Ed to inspect his van, all the contents, to prove there are no such thing as fetuses in the vehicle. Now, this is quite an odd interaction. In addition, then Ralph gets a lift home from another character we encounter a bit later in the novel, who isn't particularly significant to the plot, but it's just one of those colouring characters kind of things that King does in a very good way, right? I mean, we have to always remember King is the master of characterization. Plotting sometimes escapes him, but characterization he's his forte, really. Later on, we find he's walking again outside, and he encounters Helen, the wife of this man, badly beaten, staggering with the baby, nearly dropping the baby, and he realised that Ed has beaten this woman, and we don't know why. Now, in the background of all this, that there's a pro-life lobby group who are a little bit crazy, who are sort of campaigning about a woman coming to town called Susan Day, who's like a strong, well-known feminist and sort of advocate of women's choice. And the whole town's kind of starting to get split about this woman visiting. And Helen signed a petition, not even being particularly aware of what it was, but Ed found out, and that's the reason he beat her. So then Ralph intervenes and kind of insists that Helen calls, get some help, and arranges for her to be a shelter. There's also a cop involved who's very perceptive. Ralph is really not sure he's that perceptive. He thinks that Ralph might, because Ed turns on the charm. Ralph goes over to his house after this beating, kind of really angry, and the cop turns up, and Ralph thinks the Ed might actually charm the cop. That sort of says, "Oh no, there's a business on it," but the cop's way cannier than that, and they kind of arrest Ed, and Helen gets to stay at a woman's shelter of an unknown location to escape this man. Meanwhile, the sleep deprivation of Ralph is carrying on. And the more, he's getting less and less sleep. I think he gets down to an hour a night, and he's starting to feel really, really out of it from this. But then he starts seeing weird auras around people, like as an aspect of the insomnia. And he can see sort of auras, and he starts making out certain colours and things like that mean certain things about their health and their mental state and things like that. But then this precipitates, this sort of extrasensory power precipitates when he noticed these two little men, bald-headed men wearing coats. They look a bit like doctors, sort of hanging around on the porch of a house, and he's kind of suspicious. I think he calls it in and gets the cops involved, but they disappear. And it turns out he's seeing them, and he realises he's starting to perceive other levels of reality, in effect. But he also realises that Ed Deepno can also do these things. And as it goes on, other people in the town can sometimes see these things or aspects of them. He also has kind of a romantic or a friendship that's bordering on romance with another lady called Lois. He's got other friends too, and they kind of comment on it, and it's kind of interesting. I mean, the characterization and the character studies and the little stuff about like their lives are really, really well written in this book, and it's kind of interesting. And while I have read this book and I had very little memory of it, in fact, I got it confused somewhat with Hearts in Atlantis, rereading it, I've enjoyed it much more the second time. And this book has stuck with me. I finished reading it a couple of weeks ago, and for various reasons I've put off the recording, but it's sticking with me, and I think it's a good book. I think it's one of his really good ones. It's just not memorable in the way something like The Shining or It and things like that, and possibly even Gerald's Game, I think, is more impactful and memorable in some ways than those. It's a much more quiet book, but it does touch on a lot of aspects of the Kingiverse, if you like, and I'll get onto that in a bit. So Ralph sees these doctors, then he encounters them directly, and somehow, and I can't remember the specifics, they come up with the name Clotho and Lachesis, who are kind of related to the Fates, the three Fates in Greek mythology, who spin the thread, weave the thread, and cut the thread. It's about life, right? It's about life, actually. And he's not sure at first if they're evil, but then he realises they are actually agents of good. They are helping people pass on to the next life or the next realm when their time is done. But there is a third doctor who Ralph encounters, usually around this stray dog that Ralph sees that he calls Rosalie. It's like a crazy little ball doctor called Atropos. And basically we find out by discussing with the ball doctors and sort of talking about stuff that essentially the universe is governed by purpose and random. They're agents of purpose. Atropos is an agent of the random. Now, we also find that some characters, most people have their time kind of allotted to them, but there are occasional people who can be disconnected from this. They're kind of not bound to fate in the same way as other people. And it turns out Ed was one of these, and Atropos is kind of using Ed as an agent of some other sort of story plan that's going on. And gradually, as the novel unwinds, we start to find out what that plan is. This all eventually starts to tie back quite strongly to the Dark Tower. There are talks about, a high-rise building, and there's talk about higher beings. The Clotho and Lachesis talk about themselves as long-timers, and they call humans short-timers. But there's beings above them, above their pay grade, that are even longer-timers. So they're kind of servants of some greater thing. So it turns out Ed Deepno has not been assigned to the purpose or the random, which means he can change existence. That's success. It's possible for him to change existence. And some big bad somewhere eventually will turn out to be the Crimson King, who's a central character of the Dark Tower, is manipulating things. So Ed Deepno's disconnected and somewhat controlled or manipulated by Atropos to do a certain thing. We don't know what that is until near the end, but we do find out what it is. So the Crimson King is the big bad, Satan, whatever. In many respects, some of the discussion is he like Pennywise or is he something else? There are certain relationships to Pennywise. Is he Walter from the Dark Tower? Because the Dark Tower definitely comes into this. Some of King's other stuff comes into this too. In a trivial way, for example, there's a moment where Gage Creed from Pet Sematry's trainer is part of this collection of stuff that Atropos has got. For example, there's that kind of connection. Joubert, the weird wanderer through the woods from Gerald's game is mentioned. And there's a few others. That kind of thing is happening, but Pennywise is definitely mentioned more than once. And in fact, there's a reference to the Deadlights, and the Crimson King using the Deadlights in this. Now, King has been asked, is Pennywise and Crimson King the same thing? He hasn't answered. It doesn't appear they're the same things, but they are similar beings and aware of each other. For example, at one point, Crimson King sort of intimates there's a long history of shape-shifting in Derry. Also, we get characters straight out of it in this. Mike Hanlon runs the library, for example. And Helen gets a job at the library. So we do get Mike Hanlon in this. And also towards the end, when all the action's over, Ralph and Lois both forget what happened. Much like the Losers Club in It, once they've defeated Pennywise, they all start to forget what happened. So there is a touch of that. So what's going on? Deepno is being manipulated excessively. Now, this is a long book, but it doesn't feel long. So that's interesting, right? King often does this. He'll have a long book. Sometimes they feel painfully drawn out. Tommyknockers really bothered me, for example. But some, they fill the time wonderfully, and they don't feel long. You don't feel like this is going on and on and on, and it feels a bit of a drag. It isn't like that. It's a massively long book. It isn't like that. The Stand isn't like that. The Stand, if anything, feels too short, even after 1,200 pages or whatever it is of the uncut version. But it feels its own well. And this is one of those. It's I think a £800 page book, but it feels fine. I consumed this in audio form, and it was quite good. I got it off Audible, and it was quite a good version. I quite enjoyed listening, but it was 25, 26 hours, which is fairly long for a book. Not as long as some, but it was still pretty long. So Ralph and Lois can see these things, and they also find they have powers to combat it. For example, Ralph can send these weird, colourful beams from his hands and fire them at Atropos, which upsets Atropos greatly. And Atropos kind of tries to react against it. Anyway, to get to the nub of it, what we find out is someone needs to die at the rally that Susan Day is going to speak at. Now, initially, you think, well, is it Susan Day? She's obviously a historical character. Is killing her the thing? Turns out it's none of those. It's a small boy whose mother has to take him to the rally because she can't find a babysitter. This small boy grows up to be an artist who realises paintings about Roland the Gunslinger, so that's important. So there's a subtext here of small little things that seem insignificant have big are levers of history in many respects. Little things change things much more down. It's a bit like the butterfly effect, right? It's that kind of thing. It's that kind of thinking. So there is that. We also find that Atropos has threatened. Basically, at one point, Ralph corners Atropos and kind of makes him promise. And Atropos, these beings are not allowed to lie. They cannot lie. So he knows a promise that Atropos gives him will be kept to, where he says, "You will leave me and Lewis alone." And Atropos promises, and he says, "Yeah, but I don't have to leave everyone alone. I can still hurt you." But basically, we find out Atropos intends to try and kill Natalie, the little baby Natalie, the toddler Natalie, and Ralph, and Clotho and the Keys try and persuade Ralph he's got to try and stop Ed Deepno, but Ralph's like, "No, I'm not doing it unless you can save Natalie." And they say, "No, her life is not significant. There's a much more important one." And he says, and Ralph's like, "It's as important to me. You've got to arrange it." They basically talk to their master, their uppers. Whoever's in charge, and sort of make that arrangement with him. So they allow Ralph the power to save Natalie at the cost of his own life, it has to be said. So he has a hero's ending in the end. I won't go into all the details, but essentially it's trying to stop Ed, who is a chemist. It's established early on as a chemist, so he has chemical knowledge, doing something at this rally which would kill hundreds of people, but most importantly to the higher up somewhere, it's the killing of this little boy that's important to the Crimson King, and the stopping of it is important to whoever the good version of the Crimson. That's not made clear. Clotho and Lachesis are the good agents, essentially. So it is. I won't go into all the details, but this is a very well written book. It's interesting. It fills its time well. Though I couldn't remember reading it, it feels very memorable to me, and I think it'll be one that will stick in my mind for some time to come. And it's one I don't think I'll be forgetting anytime soon. And as I say, it has significant ties to the Dark Tower and it. And there's definitely some nods. Now, interestingly, I did read up a bit about this, and Stephen King actually regards this book as a little overwritten, and a few other books around this period was a little too try hard, but it doesn't feel like that to me. It feels like it's written in a quite nice and sort of mainlining King kind of way. It does feel like a King book. The ending's good, which is always nice for a King book. We all know about what people think about King endings, but it's kind of wonderful. In fact, there are some other links. I'm just looking on Wikipedia there, for example. Ralph Roberts does come up again as a character in the Bag of Bones, in the Stephen King book Bag of Bones, which I have read, but we will be getting it at some point. So an interesting book, Insomnia. Not one that's been converted into a TV show or a movie. It's one of those ones. And they'd be hard pressed to do that. I can see it being converted into a TV show, but I think they'd have to lose all the Dark Tower stuff, or at least only have hints of it rather than it being a bit more mainline. But I like this idea of the random and the purpose. And it's interesting that he's going back to kind of Greek mythology for this one. And, interesting, he's used a 70-year-old man as his protagonist. And Lois too. It's kind of fun. There's lots of stuff I haven't talked about, so there's still a lot of stuff to delve into this book, like the friends of Ralph and things like that, and other characters he encounters. One old man in particular who also seems to know about a lot more what's going on than anyone else. Even though he's kind of senile, he can talk with sense about certain stuff that's going on and actually help enlighten Ralph about certain things. And I always dig something that has Pennywise, even as a secondary or, quite a removed character. I always dig that. It's kind of interesting that King isn't resting on his laurels at this point in the writing. And I don't think he really does that much, ever. He's doing fresh stuff all the time. He's not like retreading Pennywise. I bet there was a big demand for more Pennywise coming to him, but he avoided that. He continued with what he wanted to do, which is very admirable. And I appreciate his skill as a writer when it comes to characterization. That remains one of his great strengths. So big recommend for me, this one. I enjoyed it greatly. I wish Herman had been here to discuss it with me. We could have gone into it much, much more, but when you're doing a solo like this, it's kind of difficult to sort of tease out all the points you really want to, because the back and forth reminds you of stuff that you don't think of. That's unfortunately the case. So the next book to cover in Kingology will be Rose Madder. However, there is some King stuff going on in TV world that I'm kind of interested in too. So it's possible I might take a diversion into some of that before we go to Rose Madder, but we'll see. Anyway, I'm sure Herman will return to this podcast sometime soon, and it'll keep going, whatever. So there we go, Insomnia, 1994, Stephen King. So thanks for listening, and goodbye from me.
Hail to the king, baby.